like to thank you for your moral force of your arguments, and I think most of us can agree that the people who perpetrated these crimes in Gaza should face the full force of justice. But I do struggle to see in your arguments actual moral consistency or constancy. How you just talked about the Houthis, for example, I'm sure it's disturbing, not only for me as a gay man, but for other gay men, when you dismiss things like the murder of tens of people at the hands of the Houthis as a mere internal issue. It strikes me that that doesn't seem very morally consistent. And likewise, I think some of your remarks on Gaza have been troubling for many women. As you know, in the October 7th massacre, the Hamas forces who entered not only murdered hundreds of teenagers our age, but also, according to the United Nations, committed a pattern of sexual violence, targeting many of the most vulnerable women, including people who were taken hostage. It strikes me to win this argument and to actually provide justice to the causes you seek about, you need to be morally consistent, and you need to understand that there's a universality in our values, where we must think about women and think about gay people, no matter where they are. And I'm wondering, have you always been the most helpful advocate for your causes?
Great question. So, in terms of the sexual violence, I've never denied it, and that there are definitely people that have clipped things out of context to make it seem as though I have. But my approach on this has always been consistent. Whether it be the Ansar Allah administration and the violent actions that they take against the gay Yemeni population, or whether it be any sort of sexual violence that anyone has been victim to, I think that that is completely unacceptable. There is no world in which that I would say that the perpetrators of such crimes should not face any justice whatsoever. I think that I simply look at historical reference points such as like the Nat Turner Rebellion, for example, or the Haitian Revolution, or even the many acts that the ANC's militant wing engaged in the struggle to abolish the apartheid in South Africa. And I recognize that when the dust is settled, those historic wrongs must be accounted for, but the much larger problem here is still always going to be the maintenance of the apartheid. So it's not necessarily that I dismiss these acts. It might come across as dismissive, but the reason as to why I cover it in the way that I do is because I understand that there is still a much greater problem, and I consider many of the ways in which people bring this up to be, I wouldn't say whataboutism, but to serve the purpose of deflecting the attention away from Israel's actions. Does that make sense?
Shall we go right there in the third row? Yeah, you. Yeah. It's up to you.
Hi, I was struggling whether or not to ask this question, but potentially following on from what was just asked. I do appreciate the work that you do for the left. I don't want to diminish the extent to which you advocate for people's, general rights to exist, especially women. However, I think maybe the person has political hate. So you have been embroiled in controversy on account of your use of sex workers in your personal life, which you do openly speak on.
Yeah.
I support making the safety and autonomy of sex workers a priority. I don't oppose the criminalisation of women who take part in this kind of labour. But I equally think that if we are to accept the premises that all work is ultimately coercive and that sex work is work, which I think we both do agree on that, then what is the word that we use in society for coerced sex, right? Secondly, do you accept that, hedging your bets, that sex workers you see are wholly consenting is perhaps naive, especially insofar as like a plumber fixing your bathroom who's in a tricky situation is incomparable in terms of the degree of suffering undertaken, like in terms of a woman engaging in sex work, for example, due to her limited options.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely correct in terms of the extra coercion that might take place, and in many instances, it is a very real problem. But I think that my approach to this has always been, first of all, I've dated sex workers as well. I'm very public and very open about my advocacy for sex work. In terms of the moral dynamic of it, yes, I understand that there is a difference there as long as people are voluntarily, as adults, consenting to the act. And the only way, I think, to ensure that that is the case is to is to not only destigmatize sex work in general, but also make sure that there are proper mechanisms in place to ensure that this is a safe process, that people are not engaging in this act involuntarily. So I understand your concerns. This is something that I've talked about with many sex workers, both on my stream and outside of that, and they seem to think that the best possible pathway forward is through decriminalization and destigmatization, and that the ways in which we currently analyze sex work is only unhelpful because it makes it virtually impossible to seek out help and to ensure that these criminal elements that are truly atrocious are prosecuted with and dealt with.
Should we go right in the back corner over there?
Trinity College is the largest and by far the richest college at Cambridge. It built over £2 billion worth of wealth through all the nefarious means you'd probably expect, including continued investment in arms companies like Elbit Systems. After student pressure and protest last year, the college pledged to divest. In October, the college broke that promise, backtracking, the master saying that they regretted creating hardship funds for students affected by conflict. My question, given this, is, as a student at that college who has been involved in organising direct action, I have been staggered by the apathy of my peers. How can students encourage other students to use their voices to pressurise the institutions in which they exist? And how can students stave off demoralisation when shouting at ears that seem not to be listening?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I think that you have to see the successes that you have gained through direct participation and direct action, such as the college encampments, and keep the pressure as best as you can, and continue the struggle, because at the end of the day, there's only so much pressure that these institutions can withstand. If there is more and more protests and more disorder, civil disobedience, campuses are inevitably going to have to buckle. And there are many different examples of success in this regard. There is a lot of academic divestment that is occurring already. But I'm sorry to hear that Trinity College went back on their promise and is continuing to I guess fund Elbit Systems. It's a truly heinous company.
Shall we go right on the back row there? Let's see.
Hi, thank you. You've kind of previously made comments about streets soaked red in the capitalist flood of landlords. In an era of really endemic political violence, where in Britain we've seen two MPs killed in the last 2 years, do you think that's kind of a constructive way of bringing a left-wing position or kind of criticising capitalism and the role of landlords into this discourse, or is it sort of something you can say from behind a camera that actually has real consequences but doesn't actually make kind of the impact that you'd hope to make?
I was talking to a landlord when I had that conversation, and I don't think that he had an issue with it. He knew that we were messing around. But given that this is a 6-year-old conversation that I had with a landlord friend of mine at the time, I wouldn't take that too seriously. But thank you. No, I am not an advocate for killing landlords.
Shall we go right there? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your speech. It seems over the past 5 years, the left has spent a lot of time building up defenses against hate speech, which in the past year and a half, have been really turned against us on college campuses. In England, the child of Holocaust survivors was arrested for terrorist speech. Why does it seem that only the right fights for free speech? Why does the left not fight for free speech? And should the left fight for free speech?
So that's an interesting question, because I think that historically the left has fought for free speech. And this still has limitations. I guess if you're talking about free speech in the American understanding, because that's the most expansive, we have never really abided by the principles of free speech to begin with. It seemingly only encompasses protecting hate speech and rarely ever speech that is truly disruptive to the pre-existing hierarchies. And what I mean by that is, and this has happened in the UK as well historically, where fascists, when they protest in the streets, they get police protection. But when you know, and there's any sort of socialist uprising or leftist uprising, they're usually the ones who have to face police brutality and police violence, at least historically. America, like I said, has the most expansive free speech protections, and yet in 32, if I'm not mistaken, it might be 36 now, states in the United States of America, you actually have to sign a pledge if you want to become a school teacher in the state of Texas, for example. You have to sign a pledge that says you will never engage in BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions on the state of Israel, which is, once again, a formerly successful initiative against apartheid South Africa. That's where BDS comes from originally. And yet we have these very obvious restrictions on free speech when it comes to Israel. I think that ultimately the notion that there is free speech absolutism is somewhat silly. It's never really existed. And I think that there are well-established boundaries that many people agree to across the board. Like, there are certain kinds of freedom of expression that obviously should be considered criminal. Child pornography, for example, like that's not protected under free speech. And some places are more expansive, others are not. But ultimately, I think it doesn't really matter. There's no real champions of free speech absolutism. That doesn't exist. I guess maybe like with the exception of Noam Chomsky. I've rarely ever heard anyone make a convincing free speech absolutist argument that is genuine. It's just not something that the right believes in. That's why they have been able to portray themselves as champions of free speech in an effort to get away with hate speech without any consequence whatsoever, because free speech doesn't mean that there should be any sort of freedom from consequences. And yet they have positioned themselves as champions of free speech while simultaneously, in the United States of America at least, right-wing groups are responsible for book bannings, books being pulled out of libraries all across the country. They very successfully launched an initiative against what they consider to be CRT, critical race theory, woke DEI policies and the like, and they have truly undermined free speech and free expression, and also just like a normal education about American history. And they've been doing this very successfully while simultaneously pointing the finger of blame at the left. So I think ultimately we just have to be reasonable about it and understand that there are very real limitations to such things. And when people cynically try to regulate free speech with honest parties that are involved in spirited debate, then you can shout them down a little bit. You can tell them, no, that's not the case. I think one very clear example of this is the conversation surrounding Israel-Palestine. In America, we censured Rashida Tlaib. She's a Palestinian congressperson. We censured her in our Congress because she said, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." This is an emancipatory slogan that I think people cynically claimed was anti-Semitic and censured her. No such censures exists for the likes of Tom Cotton, who very famously wrote a New York Times article demanding that Black Lives Matter protests be violently squashed by the military. Tom Cotton, who has demanded that pro-Palestinian protesters and environmental activists be killed for protesting and blocking roads. There is a Louisiana Senator Kennedy, who in a congressional hearing about anti-Semitism, hate speech, and Islamophobia, turned to an Arab speaker and said, that she was in support of Hamas, Hezbollah, and that she should put her head in a bag in shame. No censures existed there. No one is really principled on this, and I think it's important to point out those inconsistencies and just say, look, in order for there to be a productive conversation, there's going to be some boundaries, and if there are no boundaries, then you're not going to be able to have a productive conversation. So that's what I think. At the end of the day, I don't know. It's not a very great example. It's not a very great way to end that point, but it's not something that I have any sort of like well-defined perspective on. It's a case-by-case basis. I'll know it when I see it.
Let's go just there. Yeah, in the green.
Hi. Considering the success of right-wing initiatives across the West, how do you think these will impact the way in which left-wing speakers conduct themselves? And do you think we will see left-wing politicians engage in maybe more centrist policies, or perhaps engage in the type of rhetoric we see from the worst of their right-wing counterparts?
Oof. I hope that they don't do that, but all signs point to that right now. I mean, Seth Moulton came out and immediately after the election defeat was like, oh, we lost because the Democratic Party was too pro-trans. That was never even a conversation. There was no trans speaker at the DNC. The Democrats didn't even aesthetically point to any marginalized communities and said, we're going to defend you guys. They didn't even do that. They went super right-wing. And it seems like they are more comfortable capitulating to right-wing framing on issues like we saw with the conversation surrounding undocumented migrants and what to do. America is a nation of immigrants. The reason why we have not fallen in the trap that many developed countries have in terms of their population growth stunting is because of the unrestricted immigration into the country that has kept the nation young. And yet, the Democratic Party this time around did something that I truly consider to be unconscionable, where they caved on the right-wing framing on this issue and basically admitted that undocumented immigrants constitute a national security threat. So if they go in that direction, they're just going to keep losing as the right continues to increase the stakes. Because there's no world in which you can outflank the Republican Party on hate, on bigotry. That's their territory. That's the comfortable space that they exist